No.
The 62nd floor of Varelli Holdings overlooked the wide skyline of Dallas. Glass walls framed the city from every direction. Morning traffic crawled across the highways below while sunlight washed across the polished boardroom table. Inside the room, no one moved. A thick envelope rested at the center of the table. Crisp edges. Heavy weight. Enough money to silence many problems. Across from the envelope sat a woman who had not touched it. Her name was Nyla Reed. Nyla leaned back slightly in her chair, calm in a room filled with executives who watched her with disbelief. Their expensive suits and tense expressions reflected in the glass table between them. At the opposite end stood the man who had placed the envelope there. Ariston Valero, Portuguese-born, billionaire investor, owner of several technology firms across Texas. His reputation in Dallas carried the quiet authority of someone used to getting results quickly. Ariston rested both hands on the back of a chair, studying Nyla as if trying to calculate the next move in a negotiation. His voice broke the silence. "You know what's inside," he said evenly. No one else spoke. Nyla glanced at the envelope once. Only once. Then she looked back at him. Outside the glass wall, a helicopter crossed the sky above downtown Dallas. Inside the room, the air felt tight. Before the conversation continues, pause for a moment. If you were sitting where Nyla sits right now, and someone placed that envelope in front of you, what would you do? Would you take the money? Or would you refuse it? Write your answer in the comments. Because what Nyla Reed did next shocked every person inside that boardroom. No one in the room reached for the envelope. The directors of Varelli Holdings sat along both sides of the boardroom table, watching the silent exchange between the two people at its center. Most of them had spent years negotiating deals worth millions. They understood pressure. They understood settlements. Yet this moment felt different. Ariston Valero slowly pushed the envelope across the polished surface of the table. The paper slid forward until it stopped a few inches from Nyla Reed. The sound of it moving echoed softly in the room. "Take it," Ariston said. His voice carried patience, but also certainty. The tone of a man who believed problems had solutions, and most solutions required a price. "This ends today," he added. Nyla did not move. Her hands rested calmly on the table, fingers lightly folded together. She looked down at the envelope again. The edge of the paper reflected the light from the windows behind her. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. They knew the numbers inside that envelope. They had seen the financial approval earlier that morning. Enough money to change the direction of someone's life. Still, Nyla remained still. Ariston studied her carefully. Most people accepted offers like this without hesitation. Quiet agreements protected reputations, avoided attention, and allowed everyone to continue business as usual. But Nyla Reed had not reached for the envelope. Not once. A faint crease formed between Ariston's brows. "You asked for this meeting," he said. "This is the resolution." His gaze remained steady. "Take it." Nyla finally moved. She reached forward. But instead of picking up the envelope, she gently pushed it back across the table. Straight toward him. The room froze. The envelope stopped directly in front of Ariston Valero. For a brief moment, no one breathed. One of the directors near the window adjusted his glasses, certain he had misunderstood what he had just seen. Another executive shifted in his seat, glancing from Nyla to Ariston, as if waiting for someone to correct the moment. But no one spoke. Nyla Reed sat calmly, hands returning to their quiet position on the table. Ariston looked down at the envelope. Then he looked back at her. "You don't want it?" he asked. His tone carried less certainty now. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to confusion. Nyla held his gaze. "I didn't come here for money," she replied. The statement moved through the room like a sudden gust of wind. Several executives leaned forward. Ariston's jaw tightened slightly. "You understand what you're refusing," he said. Nyla nodded once. "I do." Outside the windows, sunlight brightened the skyline of Dallas. Cars moved along distant highways far below the building. Inside the boardroom, the silence grew heavier. Ariston slowly pulled the envelope back toward him. Most negotiations followed a pattern. Offer. Counteroffer. Agreement. This situation had already broken that pattern. What exactly do you want? He asked. Nyla paused before answering. Not out of fear. Out of certainty. Her eyes moved briefly around the room, meeting the gaze of several executives watching the exchange. Then she looked back at Ariston. I want something money can't buy, she said quietly. A murmur moved across the table. Ariston leaned forward slightly. And what would that be? Nyla's voice remained steady. The truth. The room fell silent again, because everyone in that boardroom knew exactly which truth she meant. The word hung in the room. Truth. No one moved. At the far end of the table, one board member slowly leaned back in his chair. Another shifted a file folder closer to himself, as if the papers inside might suddenly matter more. Ariston Valero did not sit. He remained standing beside the chair, the envelope resting near his hand. His expression changed. Not dramatically. Only a slight tightening around the eyes. You already know the truth, he said. Nyla Reed shook her head. No, she replied calmly. I know pieces of it. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Pieces of the truth were dangerous inside a company like Varelli Holdings. Pieces created questions. Questions created attention. And attention threatened reputations worth billions. Ariston's voice lowered. This is not the place for that conversation. Nyla held his gaze without hesitation. You invited the board, she said. That makes it exactly the place. A quiet rustle moved across the table as several executives shifted again. One of them cleared his throat softly. Nyla, he began carefully. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. She turned her head toward him. No, she answered. Her voice remained calm, but firm. This conversation has stayed private for too long. Ariston's fingers tapped lightly against the envelope. Outside the windows, clouds drifted across the bright Texas sky. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere felt tight enough to snap. You're making a mistake, Ariston said quietly. Nyla leaned forward slightly. For months, she replied, people in this company pretended nothing happened. Her eyes remained locked on his. I'm not pretending anymore. A long silence followed. Because every person at that table now understood something important. This meeting was never about money. It was about accountability. The boardroom had never felt this quiet. Dallas stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls, sunlight reflecting off towers and highways far below. Inside the room, however, every person remained still, waiting for Ariston Valero to respond. He studied Nyla Reed carefully. Not with anger, with calculation. You asked for the truth, he said slowly. His voice carried across the long table. Be careful what you request. Nyla did not look away. I already know enough, she replied. What I want is for everyone else in this room to hear it. Several executives exchanged tense looks. One of them spoke quietly. Ariston, maybe we should pause this meeting. Another nodded in agreement. But Ariston raised a hand slightly, stopping them. No, he said. His eyes remained fixed on Nyla. You turned down a settlement large enough to secure your future. The envelope sat between them again. Untouched. You could walk out of here comfortable for the rest of your life. Nyla leaned back in her chair. That's the difference between us, she said. The words landed with weight. You believe everything has a price. A long silence followed. Ariston's expression hardened slightly. And you believe the truth changes anything? He asked. Nyla answered without hesitation. Yes. Her voice remained calm. Because this company, this board, and every person in this building deserves to hear what happened. The directors shifted again. One whispered something to the man beside him. Ariston finally sat down. Slowly. His eyes never leave Nyla. You think this will end the way you expect, he said. Nyla gave a small shake of her head. No, she replied. I expect the truth. She folded her hands again. And that begins with you telling them what happened in Houston. 6 months earlier. Austin woke slowly under a soft Texas sunrise, the streets around Congress Avenue filled with the quiet rhythm of morning routines. Office workers carried coffee cups while rideshare cars pulled up along the sidewalks. Nyla Reed stepped out of a bus 2 blocks from the glass tower that dominated the business district. The building rose high above the surrounding offices, its reflective walls catching the early light. At the entrance, the silver letters read Virelli Holdings. Most people passing the tower recognized the name. The company had grown fast across Texas, attracting attention in technology, logistics, and energy investment. Nyla paused on the sidewalk and looked up. She had seen the building before. Everyone in Austin had. But today was different. Today she had a reason to walk inside. A few months earlier she had accepted a consulting role with a legal compliance firm that worked with several major companies in the city. Her work involved reviewing corporate conduct policies, ensuring companies followed the regulations they publicly promised. It was not glamorous work, but Nyla valued honesty more than prestige. Inside the building lobby, security scanners beeped softly as employees entered for the day. The space smelled faintly of polished stone and fresh coffee. Nyla stepped through the revolving door and joined the line at reception. Around her, employees moved quickly, holding phones, tablets, and briefcases. Most of them barely noticed her. She signed the visitor log and clipped a temporary badge to her jacket. "Welcome to Virelli Holdings," the receptionist said politely. Nyla thanked her and turned toward the elevator bank. She had no idea that before the week ended, her work inside this building would place her directly across the table from the man who owned it. The lobby elevators opened and closed in steady rhythm as employees moved toward the upper floors. Nyla Reed stepped inside one of the elevators and pressed the button for the 28th floor. Several other professionals joined her, their conversations quiet, focused on meetings and schedules. A man near the back checked messages on his phone. Two women discussed a presentation due later that morning. Nyla remained silent, observing the environment around her. Corporate spaces often revealed more than people realized. Body language, tone, small reactions during casual conversations. These details often showed whether a company valued its policies or simply displayed them for appearance. The elevator doors opened. The 28th floor looked different from the busy lobby below. This level held offices used by partner firms working with Virelli Holdings, legal advisors, auditors, compliance specialists. Nyla's firm occupied a corner suite overlooking the east side of the city. As she walked toward the office entrance, sunlight poured through the large windows that lined the hallway. From here, Austin spread wide in the distance, roads stretching toward quiet neighborhoods and green hills. Inside the suite, a senior partner greeted her. "Good morning, Nyla," he said, handing her a folder. "Your first assignment involves a policy review for Virelli's executive operations." She accepted the folder and glanced briefly at the cover page. Corporate Ethics Compliance Review. Routine work. At least that was what she expected. "Most of the documentation is already prepared," the partner continued. "You'll just verify the procedures and confirm everything aligns with the company's reporting." Nyla nodded. "Should be straightforward." He smiled lightly. "That's what everyone says on the first day." Nyla returned the smile politely. She had reviewed dozens of companies before, and she believed most organizations followed the rules they claimed to respect. At that moment, she still believed Virelli Holdings was one of them. Late morning sunlight brightened the glass walls of the compliance office as Nyla Reed began reviewing the documents inside the folder. The material covered executive conduct policies, internal reporting procedures, and financial disclosure requirements. Each page carried the Virelli Holdings logo and the signatures of senior administrators who approved the rules. Everything appeared organized, clear language, detailed guidelines, strong commitments to transparency. Nyla made several notes as she read. Most companies try to present themselves as responsible institutions. The real test came when people followed those policies during difficult situations. She closed the folder after an hour and leaned back slightly in her chair. Across the office, several colleagues typed quietly at their desks. The atmosphere remained calm and professional. "First day going well?" one of them asked. Nyla nodded. "So far." The colleague smiled. "Virelli's operations are impressive. The company moves fast." Nyla gathered her papers. "I'm heading downstairs to review the executive offices," she said. The colleague gave a small nod. "Good luck. That floor feels different from the rest of the building." Nyla stepped into the hallway again and returned to the elevator. This time, she selected a higher floor. The doors opened onto a much quieter corridor. The executive level. Soft carpeting absorbed the sound of footsteps. Framed photographs of company milestones lined the walls. Through several glass doors she could see assistants moving between offices. At the far end of the corridor, a larger set of double doors stood slightly open. Nyla approached carefully. Inside the room beyond the doors, a small group of executives stood around a conference table, discussing something with focused attention. One of them turned. Their eyes met briefly. The man who had just looked at her stood taller than the others. His dark suit fit perfectly. His expression carried calm authority. Someone beside her whispered his name. Ariston Valero. Nyla Reed paused near the doorway. The meeting inside the executive conference room continued, but the brief moment of eye contact had already passed. Ariston Valero returned his attention to the people around the table. Even from across the room, his presence carried quiet authority. He listened more than he spoke, allowing others to present their opinions before responding. Nyla stepped aside so she would not interrupt. An assistant approached her a moment later. "Can I help you?" the woman asked politely. Nyla showed her temporary badge. "I'm with the compliance review team. I was asked to observe how the executive floor operates." The assistant nodded with understanding. "Of course. You're welcome to review the public sections of the floor. If you need access to specific offices, let me know." Nyla thanked her. As the assistant returned to her desk, Nyla moved slowly down the corridor. Through the glass walls of several offices, she could see senior managers working quietly. Some spoke with assistants, others reviewed reports on large monitors. The environment looked calm, controlled, and efficient, exactly how a successful company should appear. But Nyla had learned something during her years of compliance work. The most important details rarely appeared in official reports. They appeared in small reactions. Unexpected pauses. Moments when people thought no one important was watching. At the end of the corridor she turned toward the windows that overlooked the city. Austin stretched wide beneath the bright sky. Behind her, the conference room door opened. Footsteps approached. "Ms. Reed." She turned. Ariston Valero stood a few steps away. He studied her with quiet curiosity. "I believe this is your first day in our building." Nyla Reed faced him calmly. "Yes," she replied. "First day reviewing your company's compliance procedures." Ariston Valero gave a small nod. Up close, his presence carried a composed confidence that explained why so many people followed his direction without hesitation. "Most visitors spend their first morning adjusting to the pace here," he said. His accent carried a faint trace of Lisbon, softened by years of working in the United States. Nyla held her folder against her side. "I'm here to understand how the executive level operates," she explained. "Observation helps confirm whether procedures match the written policies." Ariston's expression showed mild interest. Fair approach. For a moment, both of them stood beside the long window overlooking Austin. Below them, the streets moved with the steady rhythm of a growing city. Ariston glanced toward the folder she carried. "You've probably reviewed our policies already." "I have." "And?" Nyla answered carefully. "They're thorough." Ariston smiled faintly. "That sounds like a compliment." "It's an observation," she replied. The response seemed to interest him. Many people working around Ariston Valero tried to impress him. They spoke with enthusiasm, praised his leadership, or emphasized the company's success. Nyla Reed had done none of those things. She simply stated what she saw. Ariston looked back toward the conference room, where several executives were still gathered. Then he returned his attention to her. "If you need anything during your review, my office is down the hall." Nyla nodded politely. "Thank you." He began to walk away. But after a few steps, he paused. Something about the name on her visitor badge had caught his attention. He turned slightly. "Ms. Reed," he said. "Yes?" Ariston studied her again. Because for the first time that morning, he recognized something about her name that connected to a situation he thought had already disappeared from his company's records. The following week passed quickly inside Varelli Holdings. Nyla Reed spent most of her time reviewing policy records, interview notes, and internal reporting procedures. The work demanded patience. Every detail mattered. During the first few days, her interactions with the executive floor remained brief and professional, until one afternoon changed that pattern. Nyla stepped into the corridor outside the compliance suite. balancing a folder of documents against her hip while scanning several notes on her tablet. She nearly walked straight into someone. "Careful," a calm voice said. Nyla looked up. Ariston Valero stood in front of her, holding a coffee cup in one hand. He moved slightly to the side so she could pass, but his attention stayed on the papers she carried. "Still reviewing our procedures?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded toward the folder. "You've been thorough." Nyla gave a small smile. "That's the job." For a moment, they stood in the quiet hallway, sunlight stretching across the polished floor from the tall windows at the far end. Ariston studied her expression. "Most consultants finish their reports quickly," he said. "I prefer accuracy," Nyla replied. His lips curved slightly at that answer. "I noticed." He glanced toward the elevator. "I'm heading to another meeting. Walk with me." The invitation sounded casual, but the request surprised her. Still, she stepped beside him as they moved toward the elevators. Their conversation remained light at first. Questions about the review process, observations about Austin's growing business district. But as they reached the elevator doors, Nyla realized something unexpected. Ariston Valero was not speaking to her like a company owner addressing a consultant. He was speaking to her like someone trying to understand her. The elevator doors closed softly behind them. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the elevator moving upward filled the space. Ariston leaned lightly against the rail near the wall, holding his coffee while studying the numbers above the door as the floors changed. "You're not from Austin," he said. It sounded less like a question and more like an observation. Nyla shook her head. "Houston. Family there?" "Yes." The elevator slowed briefly at another floor before continuing upward. Ariston nodded once, thoughtful. "I spent most of my early years in Lisbon," he said. "Different pace from Texas." Nyla glanced toward him. "What brought you here?" "Opportunity," he answered simply. His tone carried the calm confidence of someone who had built success through discipline rather than luck. The elevator doors opened onto the executive level again. They stepped out into the quiet corridor. Evening light had begun to soften outside the windows, casting warm reflections along the glass walls of the offices. Ariston walked beside her toward the conference rooms. "You review companies for a living," he said. "Yes. And you look for what exactly?" "Consistency." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Consistency? Policies only matter when people follow them," she explained. "If behavior doesn't match the rules are meaningless." Ariston studied her face for a moment. "That must make your work difficult." Nyla smiled faintly. "Only when people hide things." The answer lingered between them. Ariston's expression shifted just slightly, not enough for most people to notice. But Nyla Reed noticed. And the reaction left her with the quiet sense that something inside this company might require closer attention. Over the next 2 weeks, their paths crossed more often. At first, the encounters happened by chance. A brief conversation near the elevators. A quiet greeting in the hallway. A short exchange outside the executive conference rooms. But gradually, the meetings became less accidental. One evening, Nyla remained at the office later than usual. Several compliance reports still required verification before the end of the week. The building had grown quieter. Most employees had already left. The distant hum of cleaning equipment echoed faintly from another floor. Nyla gathered her notes and stepped into the executive corridor to review one final document that required approval. Soft light filled the hallway from the offices still occupied. One of those offices belonged to Ariston Valero. His door stood slightly open. Inside, he sat behind a large desk, reviewing several financial charts displayed on a screen. The glow from the monitor reflected across the polished surface of the desk. Nyla knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Mr. Valero?" He looked up immediately. "Still working?" he asked. "Yes." He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Come in." Nyla stepped inside. From the office windows behind him, the lights of Austin had begun to appear across the city. Roads and buildings stretched outward beneath the darkening sky. She handed him the document she carried. "Just confirming one of the reporting procedures," she said. Ariston scanned the page quickly. "Everything seems correct." Nyla nodded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ariston leaned back slightly. You work later than most consultants. Nyla smiled faintly. I like finishing things properly. His gaze held hers for a moment longer than expected, because he had begun to notice something unusual. Nyla Reed asked questions other people avoided. Over time, their conversations grew longer. At first, the exchanges remained tied to work, policy reviews, reporting procedures, compliance standards, but the tone slowly changed. One evening near the end of the week, Nyla found herself back in Ariston Valero's office, reviewing another document that required executive confirmation. Outside the tall glass windows, Austin shimmered with night lights. Cars moved steadily along the highways, while the office tower stood quiet above the city. Ariston signed the page she had placed in front of him and set the pen aside. You've been here almost 3 weeks, he said. Nyla nodded. Long enough to understand how the company functions. And your verdict? She closed the folder carefully. Most departments follow their procedures well. Most? He asked. The faint hint of humor in his voice made her smile. Every company has areas that require attention. Ariston leaned back in his chair. You speak like someone who has seen a lot of companies. I have. He studied her expression. You don't sound impressed by wealth, he said. Nyla gave a small shrug. Money solves certain problems, she replied. His eyes held a quiet curiosity. And the problems it doesn't solve? Character. The word hung in the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ariston finally gave a small laugh. You're direct. It saves time. Their conversation drifted after that, not about policy or work, about travel, about growing up in different cities, about how ambition shaped people's choices. The discussion carried an easy rhythm. Yet beneath the comfortable tone, Nyla felt something else forming. A subtle tension. Because every time Ariston spoke about his company's success, there was one subject he carefully avoided. The detail first appeared during a small conversation that most people would have ignored. Late one evening, Nyla stood beside the long windows outside the executive offices reviewing several notes on her tablet. The building had grown quiet again. Only a few offices still showed light. Behind her, Ariston's office door opened. You're still here, he said. Nyla turned. So are you? He walked toward the windows and stood beside her, looking out across Austin. The city lights stretched far into the distance. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Nyla glanced down at the tablet in her hand. I reviewed the executive travel reports earlier, she said casually. Ariston's posture changed slightly. It was subtle. A small pause before he responded. Yes? Your company moves people around Texas often, she continued. Austin, Dallas, Houston. That's normal for operations this size. Nyla nodded. Yes. Most of the records match the schedules. She scrolled through the report again. But one trip stood out. Ariston remained silent. She turned the screen slightly so he could see the line she was reading. An overnight visit to Houston 6 months ago, she said. The documentation for that visit looks incomplete. For the first time since they had begun speaking that evening, Ariston did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes remained on the screen, only for a moment. Then he looked back at her. It was a short meeting, he said. Nyla studied his expression. Because the calm confidence she had seen in him during every conversation so far had shifted slightly. Not enough to alarm most people, but enough for someone trained to observe behavior. And that was when Nyla Reed realized something important. The truth inside Varelli Holdings might begin in Houston. The Houston entry in the travel records stayed in Nyla Reed's thoughts long after that evening's conversation. At first, she told herself it might be nothing. Executives traveled often. Meetings moved quickly across cities. Missing paperwork sometimes appeared later in the reporting system. Still, something about Ariston Valero's reaction remained in her mind. Not fear. Control. The following morning, Nyla arrived earlier than usual. Austin's business district was still waking up when she entered the glass tower of Varelli Holdings. Only a handful of employees had reached their offices. Inside the compliance suite, the lights hummed quietly above the desks. Nyla placed her bag down and opened the internal reporting database. If a trip involved company activity, records normally existed across several departments. finance, scheduling, travel coordination. She typed the Houston date into the search field. Several files appeared. Flight reservations, hotel confirmation, vehicle service. But something stood out immediately. The meeting description field remained blank. Nyla leaned closer to the screen. Every executive trip normally listed the purpose of the visit. Investor meeting, partnership discussion, government consultation. This record contained nothing. Just a simple label. Executive travel. She opened the financial approval form next. Ariston Valero's name appeared under the authorization section. Approved personally. Nyla sat back slowly in her chair. The quiet office around her remained still. It was not unusual for a company owner to approve his own travel. What felt unusual was the absence of explanation. She printed the page and placed it beside her notebook. Because if a visit to Houston required no official description, it usually meant one thing. Someone had decided the reason for that trip should remain private. Later that afternoon, the executive floor carried a different energy. Assistants moved quickly between offices. Phone calls passed through the corridor with short, serious tones. Several senior managers gathered inside the conference room that Nyla had first seen weeks earlier. From the hallway outside the compliance office, she noticed the change immediately. Corporate environments always shifted when pressure entered the room. Nyla stepped toward the elevator to deliver a set of policy confirmations to another department. As she reached the executive corridor, she heard voices from the conference room. The door stood slightly open. "Houston cannot become public," one man said firmly. Nyla slowed her steps. Another voice followed. "The investors are already asking questions." Nyla stopped beside the wall, her attention focused on the conversation inside. Then Ariston Valero spoke. His voice remained calm. "Nothing illegal happened," he said. "That isn't the concern," another executive replied. "Perception matters more than technicalities." A short silence followed. "Press attention would damage the company," someone added. Nyla's grip tightened slightly on the documents she carried. Inside the room, chairs shifted. One of the executives lowered his voice. "If the compliance review finds anything connected to that visit, we need to address it immediately." Ariston responded after a brief pause. "The review will follow normal procedures." His tone carried quiet authority. "But the Houston matter stays internal." The conversation moved to another topic. Nyla stepped away from the door and continued down the hallway before anyone could notice her standing there. Her heart beat slightly faster. Because the words she had just heard confirmed something important. Ariston Valero was not worried about breaking rules. He was worried about people discovering the truth. The following evening, the compliance office emptied earlier than usual. Most of Nyla's colleagues had finished their reports and left for the day. The quiet that followed gave her the space to review the Houston records again without interruption. Outside the large windows, Austin's skyline slowly shifted into night. Traffic lights glowed red and white along the distant roads. Nyla sat alone at her desk. The printed documents lay spread across the table beside her laptop. Flight records, expense approvals, vehicle service logs. Each piece confirmed that Ariston Valero had spent less than 24 hours in Houston. But one detail continued to trouble her. There was no listed meeting partner, no company contact, no scheduled event. It looked less like a business visit and more like a private trip hidden inside corporate paperwork. Nyla leaned back, thinking carefully. If Ariston had wanted complete privacy, he could have traveled personally without using company records. Instead, he had used the company system but left the explanation blank. Why? Her attention shifted when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Voices followed. She quickly closed the folder, but left the screen open. Two men stopped near the entrance of the office suite. Their conversation carried clearly through the quiet corridor. "It was a mistake letting Houston happen," one of them said. "You know he had no choice," the other replied. A short pause followed. Still, the first voice continued. "If anyone connects Nyla Reed to that situation." The sentence stopped abruptly. Nyla sat completely still. Because hearing her own name inside that conversation changed everything. Whatever happened in Houston was not only connected to Ariston Valero, it was connected to her. Nyla Reed remained still at her desk long after the voices in the hallway faded. Her name. The men outside had spoken it clearly, which meant one thing. The Houston trip was not only a hidden detail in Ariston Valero's records. Somehow, the situation had crossed into her life long before she ever stepped inside Varelli Holdings. She slowly reopened the folder on her desk. The flight records again. Departure from Austin. Arrival in Houston. Return the next morning. She checked the date once more. 6 months earlier. Nyla reached for her phone and opened her calendar archive. She scrolled carefully through the months until she reached the same week. Her schedule appeared on the screen. Consulting meetings. Legal review work. Travel between offices. Then her finger paused. One entry sat on the exact same day as Ariston's Houston visit. A legal consultation appointment. Location, Houston. Nyla stared at the screen. That consultation had been arranged through a small legal advisory group she occasionally assisted. The client had requested a private review concerning corporate liability concerns. At the time, the meeting had seemed routine. But the client had never appeared. Instead, a representative had delivered a sealed file with several documents that required evaluation. Nyla had reviewed the material briefly and returned the file the same afternoon. The matter ended there, or at least she had believed it ended. Now the date connected directly to Ariston Valero's unexplained trip, which raised a troubling question. Had that Houston meeting been arranged because of her involvement without her realizing it? Footsteps approached again in the hallway. Nyla closed her phone quickly. Ariston's voice carried through the quiet corridor. "Ms. Reed?" He stepped into the office doorway. And for the first time since they met, his expression showed tension. Ariston Valero stepped into the quiet office. The hallway lights behind him cast a soft glow across the doorway. Most of the building had already emptied for the evening. Nyla remained seated at her desk, the Houston documents resting beside her laptop. "You're still working late," he said. His voice sounded controlled, but the calm confidence she had seen in earlier conversations had shifted slightly. Nyla studied him carefully. "Yes." Ariston walked a few steps closer, stopping beside the edge of the desk. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nyla reached for the printed travel record and slid it across the table. "Your Houston trip," she said. Ariston glanced down. His expression remained neutral. "You've been reviewing executive records," he replied. "Yes." Another short silence filled the room. Outside the windows, Austin's city lights reflected across the glass. Nyla leaned forward slightly. "I also checked the date against my own schedule," she continued. This time Ariston looked up immediately. "And?" he asked. Nyla held his gaze. "The same day you traveled to Houston," she said quietly, "I was called there for a legal consultation." The tension between them grew instantly. Ariston did not respond. Nyla continued. "The client never showed up. Instead, someone delivered a sealed file for review." Her voice remained calm. "But now I'm wondering if that meeting was connected to you." Ariston's jaw tightened slightly. For several seconds, he said nothing. The quiet stretched long enough to confirm what Nyla had already begun to suspect. Finally, he spoke. "That meeting was never supposed to involve you." The words changed everything. Because at that moment, Nyla realized something she had not considered before. The Houston trip had not been about business. It had been about her. Ariston Valero's words stayed in the air long after he spoke them. "That meeting was never supposed to involve you." Nyla Reed sat quietly across the desk, studying him. The office lights reflected softly against the glass walls while Austin's night skyline stretched beyond the windows. "You arranged that consultation," she said. It was not a question. Ariston exhaled slowly. "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. Nyla leaned back slightly in her chair. "For what purpose?" Ariston walked toward the window, his hands resting lightly against the frame as he looked down at the city. "It was meant to review a legal exposure connected to a business situation," he said. "And you needed an outside opinion." Nyla waited. "But you didn't want the review connected directly to your name," she finished. Ariston turned toward her again. "That situation required discretion." Nyla folded her hands on the desk. "And now the same situation is the reason your board is worried about Houston becoming public." Another pause followed. Ariston did not deny it. The quiet inside the office felt heavier than before. because the line between a professional conversation and a personal conflict had now disappeared. Nyla gathered the Houston records slowly. "You should have told me the truth from the beginning," she said. Ariston's voice remained steady. "I intended to resolve the issue before it affected anyone else." Instead, Nyla replied, "You tried to hide it." Neither of them spoke for a moment. This situation now placed Nyla in a position she had faced before. A choice. Stay silent and finish the compliance review quietly, or confront something powerful enough to damage the reputation of one of the most influential companies in Texas. That night, Nyla Reed did not return home immediately. Instead, she drove south through Austin until the city lights faded behind her. The highway stretched wide under the dark Texas sky, quiet except for the occasional car passing in the distance. Her mind replayed the conversation with Ariston Valero again and again. The Houston meeting, the hidden documents, the way he admitted arranging the consultation without revealing his identity. For someone in Nyla's profession, the situation carried clear implications: corporate concealment, potential legal exposure, pressure from powerful executives trying to control information. Yet the situation felt more complicated than the cases she had handled before, because Ariston had not threatened her. He had not asked her to ignore the issue. Instead, he had simply tried to resolve it quietly before anyone discovered the truth. Nyla parked her car at a quiet overlook outside the city. From the hilltop, Austin's lights shimmered faintly in the distance. She stepped out and leaned against the railing. The night air carried a calm stillness. For the first time since the Houston discovery, Nyla allowed herself to ask a question she had avoided all evening. What did she believe about Ariston Valero? During their conversations, she had seen intelligence, discipline, and leadership. He built a company respected across Texas. But she had also seen something else: a willingness to protect his reputation at any cost. Nyla looked back toward the distant skyline. If she reported the Houston matter through the formal compliance process, the consequences would spread quickly. Investigations, public scrutiny, damage to a powerful company. But if she stayed silent, she would compromise the very principles her work represented. 2 days later, Nyla returned to Houston. This time the trip carried no mystery. She booked the flight herself and informed the compliance office that she needed to verify documentation connected to a previous legal consultation. The plane landed late in the afternoon. Houston's skyline rose above the wide highways, steel towers reflecting the fading sunlight. The city felt larger than Austin, louder, busier. Yet Nyla moved through it quietly. She drove to the same downtown building where the consultation had taken place months earlier. The lobby looked exactly the same. Polished floors, tall windows, a reception desk near the elevators. The receptionist glanced up as Nyla approached. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Nyla said politely. "I attended a consultation here several months ago regarding a sealed file review. I'd like to confirm a few details." The receptionist searched through the appointment records. After a moment, she nodded. "Yes, I see the entry. The file delivery came through a private courier service. Was the client name listed?" Nyla asked. The receptionist shook her head. "No name. Just a reference number." Nyla waited. "Is the reference number still attached to the record?" "Yes." The receptionist printed a small confirmation slip and handed it across the desk. Nyla read the code printed on the paper. Then she felt her stomach tighten. Because the reference number matched the financial authorization code used in Varelli Holdings' internal records. The Houston consultation had never been random. It had been arranged directly through Ariston Valero's company. Nyla Reed returned to her hotel room near downtown Houston, with the printed confirmation slip folded carefully inside her notebook. The city outside the window glowed with evening traffic and bright office lights. From the 22nd floor, the roads looked like moving ribbons of white and red. She sat at the desk and placed the paper beside the documents she had brought from Austin. 2 sets of records, 2 different systems, yet the codes matched perfectly. The Houston consultation had been arranged through Varelli Holdings, which meant Ariston Valero had not simply visited Houston on business. He had arranged a legal review connected to a matter he never intended to discuss publicly. Nyla opened her laptop and reviewed the file she had examined months earlier. At the time, she had treated it as routine. Now, every page carried new meaning. Financial exposure analysis, corporate liability projections, confidential settlement estimates. Her eyes moved slowly across the documents. One section near the end of the report stopped her completely. A handwritten note appeared beside the final page. The writing looked hurried.
When the truth appears, the real challenge begins. Stay silent or speak. Protect power.
A handwritten note appeared beside the final page. The writing looked hurried but clear. Contain before disclosure. Nyla stared at the words. That note had not been part of the original document. Someone had written it afterward. She leaned back slowly in the chair. Because the instruction revealed the purpose behind everything. The Houston consultation had not been about solving a legal problem. It had been about controlling the damage before anyone discovered the truth. Outside the window, Houston's skyline stretched across the dark horizon. Inside the quiet room, Nyla Reed felt the weight of a decision forming. A line existed between protecting powerful people and protecting the truth. And she knew she would soon have to choose which side of that line she stood on. Nyla Reed barely slept that night in Houston. The documents remained spread across the small hotel desk, illuminated by a single lamp, while the city outside the window slowly moved through the quiet hours before dawn. Every page pointed to the same conclusion. Ariston Valero had known about a serious problem months earlier. Instead of addressing it openly, he had attempted to contain it quietly. The instruction written across the report stayed fixed in Nyla's mind. Contain before disclosure. She closed the laptop slowly and stood near the window. Houston stretched wide beneath the pale glow of early morning. Traffic had not yet returned to the streets, leaving the city unusually calm. Nyla understood the weight of the choice ahead. If she reported the information through the compliance system, the company's internal investigation would begin immediately. Executives would face questions. Investors might react. Ariston's reputation would stand under scrutiny. But silence carried its own cost. Nyla had built her career around a simple belief. Integrity mattered most when it became inconvenient. Her phone buzzed quietly on the desk. A message from the Austin office. The compliance review deadline had been moved forward. The final report would be presented to Virelli's board within days. Nyla read the message twice. Then she looked back at the documents. The decision she had been delaying could not wait any longer. She opened her notebook and began outlining the facts connected to Houston. Not as speculation, not as suspicion, as evidence. Because when she returned to Austin, she intended to confront Ariston Valero directly and ask him to explain the truth in front of his own board. Nyla Reed returned to Austin early the next morning. The flight from Houston felt shorter than usual. Her mind stayed focused on the same decision from the moment the plane left the runway until it landed. Silence was no longer an option. By the time she stepped into the glass tower of Virelli Holdings, the business day had already begun. Employees moved quickly through the lobby with tablets and coffee cups, unaware that a major shift inside the company was approaching. Nyla walked straight to the compliance office. Her colleagues greeted her casually, assuming she had simply returned from routine travel. "Good trip?" one of them asked. "Productive," she replied. She placed her notebook and documents on her desk and opened the reporting system. The final compliance report template appeared on her screen. Normally, these reports summarized policy adherence and offered minor recommendations. Most companies received only small notes about improving internal procedures. This report would be different. Nyla began typing carefully. Executive travel records, Houston consultation, financial authorization codes. Each detail entered the document with precise clarity. She avoided speculation. Only verifiable facts. An hour later, her supervisor approached her desk. "We'll be presenting the report to Virelli's board later this week," he said. "If you've discovered anything significant, now is the time to include it." Nyla looked at the document on her screen. "I have," she replied. The supervisor studied her expression. "Serious?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Then prepare your summary." Nyla saved the report and closed the file. But she knew something important. Before the board heard the truth, one person deserved the chance to hear it first. Ariston Valero. Nyla Reed spent the rest of the morning reviewing every line of the report. Precision mattered. If she planned to confront the leader of one of Texas's most influential companies, every fact needed to stand on solid ground. She verified the Houston flight records again, then the financial authorization code, then the consultation reference number she had received from the Houston office. Each piece matched. No gaps, no uncertainty. By midday, she closed the report and leaned back in her chair. The compliance office remained busy around her. Phones rang, keyboards clicked steadily. Conversations passed quietly between desks. To everyone else, the day looked normal. For Nyla, the direction of the story had already changed. She opened her email and began drafting a short message. Subject line: request for executive meeting. Her fingers paused briefly above the keyboard. Once the message was sent, there would be no returning to quiet observation. The situation would move directly toward confrontation. Nyla finished the message. Mr. Valero, I need to discuss findings related to the Houston consultation before the board review. The matter involves documentation connected to your travel authorization. I recommend we meet today. She read the message twice. Clear, professional, direct. Then she pressed send. The email left her screen and entered the internal system. Nyla placed her phone on the desk and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Finally, the notification sound appeared on her computer. Reply from Ariston Valero. She opened the message. One short sentence. Come to the executive floor at 4. No explanation, no questions. Nyla closed the email slowly, because the moment she had been preparing for had now arrived. At exactly 4 in the afternoon, Nyla Reed stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor. The corridor felt quieter than usual. Thick carpeting softened every footstep, and the glass offices along the hallway reflected the warm light of late afternoon. Several assistants looked up briefly as she passed. Most of them recognized her by now. The consultant from the compliance team who asked careful questions and stayed later than everyone else. Nyla walked toward the end of the corridor where Ariston Valero's office overlooked the western side of Austin. The door stood closed. She knocked once. Come in. Ariston's voice carried calmly from inside. Nyla opened the door and stepped into the room. The office looked the same as always. Large desk. Clean surfaces. Tall windows revealing the city stretching across the horizon. Ariston stood near the window rather than behind the desk. His jacket rested on the back of a chair, sleeves of his shirt rolled slightly at the forearms. You wanted to speak before the board review, he said. Nyla placed her folder on the desk. Yes. Ariston studied her expression carefully. You went back to Houston. It was not a question. Nyla nodded. I verified the consultation record. A brief silence passed between them. Outside the windows, the sunlight began to fade across the Austin skyline. Ariston moved closer to the desk. What did you find? Nyla opened the folders slowly and turned the documents toward him. The consultation request was submitted through your company's authorization system, she said. Ariston looked down at the papers. You arranged the meeting anonymously. He did not deny it. Nyla met his gaze again. And the purpose of that meeting, she said, was to contain a situation before it became public. Ariston Valero studied the documents quietly. His eyes moved across the printed pages without visible reaction. Years of leading negotiations had taught him how to control expression in difficult moments. Finally, he placed the papers back on the desk. You've been thorough, he said. Nyla remained standing across from him. This situation affects your company's compliance review, she replied. I had to be thorough. Ariston walked toward the window again, looking down at the city below. Austin's evening traffic had begun to thicken. Long streams of headlights moved along the highways like lines of light. You believe this meeting in Houston proves misconduct, he said. I believe it proves concealment, Nyla answered. Ariston turned slightly. That is a strong accusation. It's an accurate one. The room fell quiet again. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then, Ariston returned to the desk. What exactly do you plan to do with this information? He asked. Nyla did not hesitate. I will include it in the final compliance report. The answer carried calm certainty. Ariston leaned forward slightly, resting both hands against the desk. You understand what that means? Yes. Investors will react. I know. The company will face scrutiny. That's likely. Ariston's voice lowered. And my leadership will be questioned. Nyla held his gaze. You arranged the Houston consultation because you expected exposure, she said. Now the exposure is happening. Another long silence filled the office. This time Ariston did not argue. He simply watched her, because he had begun to realize something important. Nyla Reed had already made her decision. The silence inside the office stretched for several seconds. Ariston Valero remained still behind the desk, his gaze fixed on Nyla Reed. Most people in his position would attempt negotiation, a promise, a compromise, another quiet solution. But Nyla's expression made something clear. This conversation was no longer about persuasion. You're determined to move forward with this, Ariston said. Yes. Her voice carried no hesitation. Ariston studied her face carefully, as if measuring the weight of the decision she had already made. You understand what will happen once the board hears this, he said. Nyla nodded. They deserve to hear it. Ariston exhaled slowly. For months he had managed the Houston situation carefully, keeping it away from attention while trying to resolve the consequences privately. Now that control had shifted. And it had shifted because of the woman standing across the desk. You want accountability, he said. Yes. Then let's not do this halfway. Nyla watched him closely. What do you mean? Ariston walked around the desk and reached for the phone on the corner of the table. He pressed a button that connected directly to the executive assistant outside. Schedule a full board session tomorrow morning, he said calmly. The assistant responded through the speaker. Yes, Mr. Valero. Add Miss Reed to the agenda. Nyla felt the weight of the moment settle in the room. The decision she had made now moved beyond a private conversation. It was becoming a formal confrontation. Ariston placed the phone back down and looked at her again. Tomorrow, he said. The truth will be discussed in front of everyone. Nyla gathered her documents slowly. Because the power inside this story had just shifted. And the next conversation would take place in the boardroom. The next morning arrived faster than Nyla expected. The boardroom on the 62nd floor of Varelli Holdings looked even larger in daylight. Floor-to-ceiling windows surrounded the room, revealing the wide skyline of Dallas beneath a bright Texas sky. A long polished table stretched through the center. Around it sat the senior directors of the company. Quiet, attentive, waiting. Nyla Reed stood near the far end of the table with her folder resting against the surface. The documents she carried held the same information she had reviewed the night before. Across from her sat Ariston Valero. His posture remained composed, his expression calm despite the tension moving through the room. One of the board members spoke first. Ms. Reed, he said, adjusting his glasses. We understand you requested this session to present concerns related to the Houston records. Yes, Nyla replied. She opened the folder slowly. Before she could speak again, Ariston raised a hand slightly. One moment. The directors turned their attention toward him. Ariston reached beside his chair and lifted a sealed envelope. The room watched as he placed it carefully on the table. Then he slid it forward. The envelope moved across the polished surface until it stopped directly in front of Nyla Reed. Several board members exchanged brief glances. They understood what they were seeing. Ariston's voice remained steady. You've worked with companies long enough to know how situations like this are normally handled. Nyla looked down at the envelope. She already knew what it contained. A settlement. Quiet resolution. Protection for the company. Ariston leaned slightly forward. This matter does not need to go further, he said. The room remained silent, because everyone present waited to see what Nyla Reed would do next. The envelope rested on the table between them. No one in the boardroom spoke. Several directors leaned back in their chairs, watching the quiet exchange with careful attention. They had witnessed difficult negotiations before, but this moment carried a different kind of weight. Nyla Reed did not reach for the envelope. Her eyes remained on Ariston Valero. You're offering a settlement, she said. Ariston nodded slightly. A practical resolution. One of the directors folded his hands together, his voice calm but firm. Ms. Reed, situations like this often require discretion. Another director added quietly, "Protecting the company protects everyone involved." Nyla listened without responding. The sunlight outside the windows reflected across the polished boardroom table, illuminating the envelope sitting in front of her. Ariston spoke again. "The contents represent a fair agreement," he said. "More than fair." Nyla glanced down briefly. The envelope remained sealed. She knew exactly what it contained without opening it. Financial compensation, confidential terms, a promise that the Houston matter would remain buried inside company records. Ariston's tone softened slightly. "You built a reputation for integrity in your profession," he said. "This offer does not change that." Nyla raised her eyes to meet his again. "You're asking me to remain silent." "I'm asking you to consider the consequences," he replied. The directors watched both of them carefully. One cleared his throat. "The company employs thousands of people," he said. "Public exposure would create unnecessary damage." The room fell quiet again. Because the offer sitting on the table represented more than money. It represented the choice between protecting a powerful institution and revealing the truth. Nyla Reed kept her hands resting on the edge of the boardroom table. The envelope remained untouched. Across the room, several directors watched closely, their expressions controlled but tense. Ariston Valero spoke again. "The amount inside that envelope would secure your future," he said calmly. No one interrupted him. "You could leave this room today without carrying the weight of a corporate conflict," he continued. Nyla listened carefully. Ariston's tone never sounded aggressive. He spoke like a man explaining a practical solution to a complicated problem. "This company built partnerships across Texas," he added. "Thousands of families depend on its stability." Nyla finally responded. "You're asking me to protect the company. I'm asking you to protect everyone affected by it." The distinction lingered between them. A director near the center of the table leaned forward. "Ms. Reed, the board values transparency," he said carefully. "But sometimes leadership requires discretion." Another member nodded slightly. "Damage spreads quickly once public attention becomes involved." Nyla looked around the room. Each person seated at the table represented power, influence, and financial responsibility. Their concern felt real. But so did the evidence inside her folder. She turned her attention back to Ariston. "You arranged the Houston consultation to contain a problem," she said. "Yes." "You tried to resolve it quietly before anyone discovered the truth." "Yes." Nyla glanced down at the envelope again. The silence in the room deepened. Because everyone present understood something important. The next action Nyla Reed took would determine whether the Houston situation remained hidden or moved into the open. The silence inside the boardroom grew heavier. Nyla Reed looked down at the envelope again. Its edges were perfectly aligned with the center of the polished table, as if the placement had been measured carefully. Across from her, Ariston Valero remained calm. He did not rush her. He did not repeat the offer. He simply waited. Nyla understood why. Pressure did not always require raised voices. Sometimes the quiet weight of expectation carried more force than any argument. A director near the window folded his hands. "Miss Reed," he said carefully, "every company faces complicated moments." Another added, "Responsible leadership involves protecting the broader organization." Nyla listened but did not respond. The sunlight behind them had shifted slightly across the skyline of Dallas, casting long reflections across the boardroom windows. Ariston leaned forward slightly. "You built your career around integrity," he said. "Yes. Then understand this." His voice remained steady. "Integrity sometimes includes protecting people who had no role in a mistake." The statement carried weight. Nyla looked around the room again. Several directors watched her with serious expressions. Others avoided eye contact, staring quietly at the table. Ariston spoke once more. "The money in that envelope will allow you to walk away without consequences," he said. "No investigations. No conflict. No pressure from the corporate world." Nyla's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table. The envelope remained only inches away. For many people, the decision would already be made. Ariston's final words filled the quiet room. "You can end this now." Nyla Reed kept her eyes on the envelope for a moment longer. Then she slowly looked back at Ariston Valero. The boardroom remained completely silent. Every director watched the exchange without speaking. Nyla finally placed one hand on the envelope. A few of the executives shifted in their chairs, believing they already understood the outcome. But Nyla did not open it. Instead, she turned her attention to the people seated around the table. "Before I respond," she said calmly, "I want everyone here to understand something." Her voice carried clearly through the room. "This envelope represents more than money." Several directors exchanged uneasy glances. "It represents the decision to keep the Houston situation hidden." Ariston said nothing. Nyla continued, "If I accept this offer, the matter ends quietly." She paused briefly. No investigation, no explanation, no accountability. The weight of her words filled the boardroom. Then she turned back to Ariston. "You believe the consequences of exposure will damage this company?" "Yes." "You believe silence protects the people who work here?" "Yes." Nyla rested her hand on the envelope again. This time she gently pushed it back across the table, straight toward him. Gasps moved softly across the room. "Before we continue," she said, looking around the table again, "I want to ask something." Her gaze moved from one executive to another, because this moment did not belong only to her. "If you were sitting where I'm sitting right now," she asked, "and someone placed that envelope in front of you, what would you do? Would you take the money? Or would you choose the truth?" The envelope slid back across the table until it stopped in front of Ariston Valero. The room reacted instantly. A quiet wave of movement passed through the board members. Several of them exchanged surprised looks while others leaned forward slightly, as if trying to confirm what they had just witnessed. No one expected the envelope to return. Nyla Reed kept her posture steady. Her hands rested calmly on the edge of the table. Ariston looked down at the envelope. Then he lifted his eyes toward her. "You're refusing the offer," he said. "Yes." The answer arrived without hesitation. A director near the center of the table spoke carefully. "Ms. Reed, I encourage you to think about this again." Another added, "Situations like this rarely benefit anyone when they become public." Nyla turned toward them. "I have thought about it." Her tone remained calm, but firm. "I spent days reviewing the Houston records." She placed her folder on the table and opened it slowly. The sound of the pages moving echoed through the silent room. "Your company arranged a private consultation to contain a situation before it reached the public." No one interrupted her. "You attempted to resolve the matter quietly." Her eyes returned to Ariston. "And this envelope represents the final step in that plan." The directors watched carefully. Because the moment had shifted. Ariston Valero had entered the meeting expecting control. Now the control had moved somewhere else. Nyla closed the folder again. "This conversation is no longer about money," she said. "It's about accountability." The boardroom remained still. Nyla Reed's words hung in the air while the directors absorbed the shift in tone. The offer meant to quiet the situation had just been rejected in front of everyone. Ariston Valero rested his hands on the table. His expression remained composed, though the calm certainty from earlier had faded slightly. "You understand the position you've placed yourself in," he said. Nyla met his gaze. "Yes." A director near the far end of the table spoke again. "Ms. Reed, you're asking this company to expose a matter that may not require public attention." Nyla turned toward him. "I'm asking the board to acknowledge what already happened." Another director leaned forward. "Every major organization faces complicated decisions. And every organization claims to value integrity," Nyla replied. Her voice remained steady. "If those values matter, this board should not fear transparency." A quiet murmur moved around the table. Ariston finally reached for the envelope. He lifted it slowly and placed it beside his chair. The gesture made something clear. The offer had ended. "You're forcing a confrontation," he said. "I'm asking for honesty." The difference between the two statements filled the room. Several executives avoided eye contact now, staring at documents in front of them. Others watched Nyla carefully. Because they had begun to realize something important. The consultant they expected to negotiate quietly had turned into the most powerful voice in the room. And the direction of the meeting now followed her lead. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension inside the boardroom had shifted from negotiation to confrontation. Nyla Reed stood quietly at the end of the table while the directors considered the situation unfolding in front of them. Ariston Valero broke the silence. "You've made your position clear," he said. His tone remained controlled, but the authority he carried earlier had softened slightly. "What exactly do you expect this board to do?" Nyla placed both hands lightly on the folder in front of her. "I expect the truth to be acknowledged," she replied. Several directors exchanged uncertain looks. One of them spoke cautiously. "Ms. Reed, companies manage internal matters every day without public escalation." "Yes," Nyla said. "But those matters usually involve mistakes that leadership accepts responsibility for." Her eyes returned to Ariston. "You arranged the Houston consultation to protect your reputation." Ariston did not respond. "You attempted to contain the situation through private legal review." Still no response. "And when that plan failed, you attempted to resolve it with money." The words echoed across the room. A director near the window leaned forward. "Ms. Reed," he said, "what outcome are you proposing?" Nyla took a breath before answering. "The board deserves to understand exactly what happened in Houston." The room grew quiet again, because for the first time, the conversation had moved beyond refusal. Now it was moving toward revelation, and everyone present sensed that the explanation Nyla Reed carried inside that folder would change how they viewed the man sitting at the center of the table. The directors waited. Every eye in the boardroom rested on Nyla Reed. She opened the folder slowly and placed several pages across the table so the closest members could see the documents clearly. "These are the verified records connected to the Houston consultation," she said. Ariston Valero remained silent. Nyla continued. "The travel authorization was approved personally by Mr. Valero." She pointed to the financial code printed on the page. "The consultation itself was requested through an anonymous submission using the company's internal authorization system." One of the directors leaned closer to the documents. "This consultation was legal in nature?" he asked. "Yes," Nyla replied. Another director spoke. "What exactly was being reviewed?" Nyla lifted another page from the folder. "Corporate liability connected to a situation that occurred 6 months ago." Ariston's expression tightened slightly. Nyla noticed the reaction. The legal analysis estimated significant exposure if the situation became public. A murmur moved quietly across the table. Several executives began reading the pages now. Nyla placed the final document beside the others. This note was written after the consultation concluded. She turned the paper so the directors could see the handwritten message clearly. "Contain before disclosure." The words sat plainly on the page. A long silence followed. One of the directors looked up slowly. "Mr. Valero," he said carefully, "is this accurate?" Ariston did not answer immediately. The tension inside the room had grown thick enough that even the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system seemed loud. Because the evidence in front of them had removed any uncertainty. The Houston situation had been hidden deliberately. The boardroom remained silent after the final document touched the table. Several directors studied the handwritten note again. "Contain before disclosure." The meaning required no interpretation. One of the senior members of the board slowly removed his glasses and placed them beside the papers. "Mr. Valero," he said carefully, "we need to understand the situation clearly." Ariston Valero remained seated. His gaze moved from the documents to Nyla Reed. The authority he carried throughout the meeting had changed, not gone, but no longer unquestioned. "What exactly occurred in Houston?" the director asked. Ariston exhaled slowly. But before he could respond, Nyla spoke again. "There's one more detail the board should understand." Every head turned toward her. "The Houston consultation was not only about financial exposure," she said. A few directors leaned forward. Nyla kept her voice steady. "The documents describe a settlement scenario involving an individual who was affected by a corporate decision connected to this company." Another quiet reaction moved around the table. "Who?" someone asked. Nyla paused briefly. Then she looked directly at Ariston. The situation involved someone whose professional review could determine whether the matter became public. The directors began to understand. A consultant. A compliance review. Someone with access to the company's internal records. Nyla placed her hand lightly on the final document. "The Houston consultation was arranged to prepare for the possibility that I would discover the truth." The realization spread across the room. Because the board now understood something none of them expected. The situation Ariston had tried to contain was not only about the company. It was about Nyla Reed herself. No one spoke for several seconds after Nyla Reed's final statement. The boardroom that had once felt controlled now carried a different weight. Not negotiation, not strategy. Consequence. Several directors sat back slowly in their chairs, absorbing what they had just heard. Ariston Valero remained still. For the first time since the meeting began, he did not appear to be measuring the room or guiding its direction. He simply sat with the documents in front of him, the envelope now forgotten beside his chair. A senior board member broke the silence. "Mr. Valero," he said, voice steady, "did you arrange legal preparation in anticipation of Miss Reed discovering this matter?" Ariston looked at the papers before answering. "Yes." The admission landed heavily. Another director spoke next. "Did you intend to resolve this privately before the board became aware of it?" "Yes." This answer came more quietly. The skyline outside the windows had begun to soften toward evening. Dallas stood beneath a pale golden light, distant towers reflecting the slow approach of sunset. Inside the room, the shift in power felt complete. One of the directors folded his hands. "This is no longer a compliance matter alone," he said. "This is a leadership matter." No one challenged him. Nyla remained standing with her folder closed in front of her. She did not look triumphant. She looked steady. Because this moment was not about humiliation. It was about truth finally reaching the people who were supposed to hear it. Before the next part of this story unfolds, say what you believe. Should the final outcome be guided by justice? Or should forgiveness still have a place here? Write your answer in the comments. Because Ariston Valero now had to face something money could not soften. The consequences of his own choices. The boardroom remained quiet after Ariston Valero's admission. The directors looked at one another, weighing the seriousness of the moment. For years, they had trusted Ariston's leadership to guide the company through growth and competition across Texas. Now that leadership stood under question. One of the older members of the board spoke carefully. "Mr. Valero, the board trusted you to manage risks transparently." Ariston nodded once. "I understand." Another director leaned forward. "You believed the situation could be handled privately." "Yes." "And you believed the board did not need to know." Ariston rested his hands together on the table. "I believed I could resolve it without causing unnecessary damage." The explanation sounded calm, but the consequences behind it were clear. Nyla Reed stood quietly at the far end of the table, observing the conversation without interruption. The directors returned their attention to her. "Ms. Reed," one of them said, "your report indicates the Houston matter involved a corporate decision that affected an outside party." "Yes." "And the consultation was intended to evaluate the financial exposure." "Yes." The director nodded slowly. "Meaning the company's reputation was already at risk before this meeting." Nyla closed the folder gently. That risk existed the moment the situation occurred. A long silence followed. Because the board now understood something important. The company had not been facing a future problem. The problem had existed for months. And their own leader had chosen to manage it alone instead of bringing it forward. Outside the windows, the sun continued lowering toward the Texas horizon. The meeting ended without a formal decision. The directors requested time to review the documents privately before announcing their next step. One by one they left the boardroom, carrying copies of the Houston records and the compliance report Nyla had prepared. The room gradually emptied. Soon, only 2 people remained. Nyla Reed stood near the window overlooking the city. Ariston Valero remained seated at the long table. The golden light of the Texas sunset stretched across the skyline outside. Dallas looked calm from 62 floors above the ground. Inside the room, the atmosphere felt different from earlier. The tension of confrontation had faded. What remained was reflection. Ariston finally stood and walked slowly toward the window. For a moment neither of them spoke. "You achieved what you came here to do," he said quietly. Nyla did not look at him immediately. "I came here to complete a review honestly." Ariston nodded slightly. "And you did." The two of them watched the skyline together. Ariston broke the silence again. "When I started this company, I believed control solved most problems. Nyla turned slightly toward him. And now? He looked out over the city again. Now I understand control creates its own problems. The admission carried no defensiveness, only acceptance. Nyla studied his expression carefully. Because this moment felt different from the earlier confrontation, not negotiation, not strategy. Something closer to realization. The consequences of Houston had already changed the direction of Ariston Valero's future. But neither of them yet knew how far those consequences would go. Later that evening, the building had grown quiet. Most employees had already left the offices, and the long corridors of Varelli Holdings carried only faint echoes of distant footsteps from the cleaning staff. Nyla Reed gathered her documents and returned to the compliance office. The report now sat finalized on her desk. Everything she had discovered about Houston had been documented clearly. No speculation, no exaggeration. Only the facts. She closed the folder and looked through the large window beside her desk. Austin's skyline glowed under the deep orange colors of sunset. For the first time since the confrontation began, the tension in her chest began to ease. She had done what she believed was right, but doing the right thing rarely ended the story immediately. Her phone buzzed softly. A message from one of the board members. The board would reconvene the following morning. They would review leadership responsibilities and determine the company's next direction. Nyla placed the phone back on the desk. Across the city, Ariston Valero sat alone in his office on the executive floor. The envelope from earlier still rested on the corner of his desk. He picked it up slowly and turned it in his hands. The solution he believed would end the situation had failed. Money had not worked. Silence had not worked. For the first time since Houston happened, he had no control over what came next. He set the envelope down and looked out at the fading Texas skyline. Because tomorrow morning would decide something far greater than a corporate problem. It would decide who he would be after the truth became public. The following morning arrived quietly. Sunlight stretched across the skyline as Dallas woke to another business day. Inside the Varelli Holdings tower, the executive floor remained calm, though everyone knew the board would meet again within hours. Nyla Reed arrived early. She stepped into the compliance office and placed the final report on her desk one last time. Every page remained exactly as she had written it. Clear, direct, unavoidable. She looked out the window for a moment, watching the city move below. This story had begun with a single unexplained trip to Houston. Now it had reached a point where the future of a powerful company could change. Her phone buzzed again. A short message from the board secretary. The directors were ready. Nyla gathered the folder and walked toward the elevator. At the same time, on the executive floor above, Ariston Valero stood in front of the large window inside his office. The skyline looked different this morning. Less distant, more real. For months, he had tried to contain the consequences of a decision made in Houston. Today, those consequences would be addressed openly. He adjusted his jacket and walked toward the door. Two people entered the elevator from different floors of the same building, both heading toward the same boardroom, both understanding the same truth. After today, their lives would not move in the same direction they had before. What the board decided next would shape everything that followed. And the outcome was still uncertain. The boardroom filled again the following morning. Sunlight poured through the tall windows overlooking Dallas, illuminating the long table where the directors had gathered once more. Nyla Reed entered quietly and placed her report on the table. Moments later, Ariston Valero stepped into the room. The directors watched both of them carefully. The atmosphere felt calmer than the previous day, though the importance of the moment remained clear. One of the senior board members began the discussion. "We reviewed the documents Ms. Reed presented yesterday," he said. Several directors nodded. The Houston situation revealed a serious failure in leadership judgment. The words were not harsh, but they carried weight. The same director continued. Mr. Valero attempted to resolve the matter privately, instead of informing the board. Ariston stood beside the table, listening. Another director spoke. The decision placed the company in a vulnerable position. Silence followed. Then the senior member turned toward Ariston. "Mr. Valero, the board has reached a conclusion." Ariston met his gaze. "We believe accountability must begin with leadership." The message was clear even before the next sentence arrived. Effective immediately, you will step aside from executive authority while the board reorganizes leadership responsibilities. The room remained quiet. Ariston did not argue. He nodded once. I understand. The directors then turned toward Nyla. Miss Reed, the senior member said, your report forced this company to confront a truth it might otherwise have ignored. Nyla responded calmly. My responsibility was to present the facts. The meeting ended soon after. But the meaning behind the moment extended far beyond a boardroom decision. When the board members began leaving the room, the tension that had filled the building for days finally started to fade. Several directors stopped beside Nyla Reed before exiting. One of them spoke quietly, you did the right thing. Another added, situations like this test people in ways most never face. Nyla accepted the comments politely but did not linger on them. Across the room, Ariston Valero gathered the documents that had been placed in front of him during the meeting. He moved calmly, without frustration or resistance. The decision had been made. Leadership would change. Responsibility would follow. When the last director left the boardroom, only 2 people remained. Nyla stood near the window again. The Dallas skyline stretched wide beneath the morning sun, the same view that had witnessed the confrontation the day before. Ariston approached slowly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said something unexpected. You were right to refuse the envelope. Nyla turned toward him. That wasn't the difficult part, she replied. What was? Telling the truth when the truth would cost someone something. Ariston nodded. I spent years believing strength meant protecting everything I built, he said. Nyla listened. But protecting something the wrong way eventually destroys it anyway. The words carried quiet acceptance. Nyla looked back toward the city. What happens next for you? She asked. Ariston considered the question. For the first time in a long time, he said, I'll have to rebuild something honestly. The answer carried no resentment, only reflection. The following week brought visible changes to Varelli Holdings. News of the board's internal restructuring spread quietly through the company. Senior managers attended new meetings. Departments reviewed procedures that had once gone unquestioned. For many employees, the shift felt sudden. For Nyla Reed, it felt necessary. She spent the next few days completing the final compliance documentation before preparing to leave Austin. Her consulting assignment with the company had officially ended. On her last afternoon in the building, she packed the remaining files into a slim folder. Outside the compliance office window, the city stretched under a bright Texas sky.
The story did not end with a boardroom decision. It ended with a reminder. Money can protect power, but dignity protects the soul.
Outside the compliance office window, the city stretched under a bright Texas sky. Her phone buzzed. A short message appeared on the screen. Ariston Valero. If you have a moment before you leave the building. Nyla read the message once before responding. She took the elevator to the executive floor one final time. The corridor felt quieter now. Ariston's office door stood open. He looked up as she entered. I wanted to thank you before you left, he said. For what? For forcing me to face something I avoided. Nyla leaned lightly against the back of a chair. You didn't avoid it forever, she replied. He gave a small nod. Still longer than I should have. They stood near the windows overlooking Austin again. The same place where their earlier conversations had begun. Ariston reached into the drawer of his desk and placed a small object on the table between them. Not money. A simple company access badge. The board asked me to return everything connected to the company, he said. The gesture felt symbolic. A reminder that leadership, like trust, could be lost when integrity disappeared. Nyla Reed looked at the badge resting on the desk. For years it had represented authority inside Varelli Holdings. Doors opened because of it. Decisions followed it. Now it was simply a small piece of plastic placed quietly on the table. Ariston Valero watched the city outside the window. When I started this company, he said slowly, I believed success meant never losing control. Nyla listened without interrupting. I worked harder than anyone around me, he continued. Every deal, every expansion, every partnership, control made everything possible. He paused. But Houston showed me something else. Nyla turned slightly toward him. What was that? That control can make people hide mistakes instead of facing them. The room remained quiet. Outside the window, The afternoon sun moved slowly across the skyline of Austin. Nyla folded her arms gently. "You still built something important," she said. "Yes," Ariston replied. "But the way a person protects what they build matters." The statement carried the weight of someone who had finally accepted responsibility. For several seconds, they both watched the city below. Then Ariston looked back at her. "You asked for the truth in that boardroom." "Yes. And now the company will move forward differently because of it." Nyla did not respond immediately. Instead, she walked toward the desk and picked up the badge. She turned it over once, before placing it back where it had been. "That wasn't about the company," she said quietly. Ariston raised an eyebrow. "It was about dignity." The word lingered in the quiet office. Later that evening, Nyla Reed stepped outside the Varelli Holdings building for the final time. The warm Texas air carried the quiet sounds of the city moving into the evening. Cars rolled steadily through the streets while the sky above Austin faded into deep shades of orange and blue. She paused on the sidewalk and looked up at the tower. For weeks that building had been the center of a conflict involving power, reputation, and truth. Now the conflict had ended. Not with anger. Not with victory. With clarity. Across the city, in a quiet office high above the streets, Ariston Valero stood alone near the window where he had spent so many years planning the future of his company. The skyline stretched wide beneath the fading light. For the first time in a long time, the view looked different. Not because the city had changed, because he had. Control once defined his leadership. Now accountability would define whatever came next. Down on the street, Nyla turned and began walking toward the corner. Her work there was finished. She had refused money. She had chosen honesty. And she had protected something that wealth could never replace. Integrity. As the evening lights of Texas slowly appeared across the skyline, the lesson of the story settled quietly. Money can solve many problems. Power can protect many reputations. But dignity has no price. And once a person chooses truth over comfort, the direction of their life changes forever. The question that remains now belongs to you. When the moment arrives where money offers silence, what would you choose?